Good morning, everyone. I am so excited to be here, and I want to thank Rory, Dorina, Rebecca, and all of the organizers of LitFest and everyone here at Bali for their hospitality, their generosity. It is really, really an honor to be here, and I'm so thrilled. I was given the somewhat daunting task of talking about something that does not seem to have a lot of solutions, and that is the role that agriculture plays in climate change. This job for me, though, however, is made a little bit easier because of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years. My organization, Food Tank, which you heard a little bit about, our mission is really to highlight stories of hope and success in the food system. I've had this really amazing opportunity to travel to 60 plus countries across sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of farmers and researchers, scientists, economists, journalists, women's advocates, youth leaders, and others who are really on the front lines of fighting climate change every day in their own communities. What they have taught me is that there's a lot of hope and a lot of innovation happening in fields, kitchens, laboratories, boardrooms, town halls, on smartphones and on laptops across the globe, helping farmers and eaters mitigate and adapt to climate change. What I'll plan to do very briefly this morning is to give you an overview of agriculture's contribution to climate change, and then talk about the solutions and how agriculture and the food system can play a really important role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What's incredible to me personally is that many of the innovations that farmers are using to adapt and mitigate climate change also have incredible side benefits and really unintended consequences, including helping improve food security, increasing incomes, improving social justice and equality, and protecting the environment in ways that go well beyond simply mitigating climate change. I'm reminding you that there are solutions because, unfortunately, I have to start off with the bad news. Agriculture is the human endeavor most likely to be impacted by climate change, while at the same time, food production from farm to fork to landfill is contributing to increased greenhouse gas emissions. Farmers are unfortunately very often blamed for their role in climate change, and honestly, their contributions are hard to ignore. According to the World Bank and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, agriculture and the food system contributes roughly 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, food production is already suffering from the impacts of climate change, and flooding, drought, and other erratic weather events are increasing in both intensity and duration. In addition, the IPCC predicts that it's the world's smallholder farmers who will likely be most impacted by the effects of rising greenhouse gas emissions. These farmers are literally already living on the edge, and any disruption to food production can have dire impacts on nutrition and health, as well as social issues, including migration, urbanization, and conflict. And if that wasn't enough reason to worry, climate change and rising temperatures are predicted to lead to rising sea levels, decreasing soil fertility, and increased soil acidification, which will make food production in the 21st century even more unpredictable, uncertain, and difficult than it already is today. Pretty depressing, right? I wouldn't blame you if you ran screaming from the room. I'd like to do that, and I have to think and write about these issues all the time. But there is good news, I promise you. Farming can be sophisticated and varied enough to adapt to the effects of climate change. For example, planting indigenous vegetables and traditional crop varieties, preventing food loss and food waste, and investing in women farmers can all reduce the impacts of climate change and help nourish both people and the planet. Essentially, I think there is a recipe for mitigating climate change that all of us as eaters, farmers, businesses, and policymakers can contribute to. So I only have a few minutes here today, but what I'd like to do is go through some of these solutions and some of the opportunities that I think need more attention, more research, and more investment to make agriculture truly climate friendly. Let me just start off by describing how some young farmers are going forward by looking back to traditional and indigenous crop varieties and growing the foods that their grandparents and great-grandparents used to cultivate. In Uganda, I had the opportunity to visit a project called Developing Innovations in School Cultivation, or Project DISC. This project is co-founded by a young visionary named Eddie Mukibi, who is now the vice president of Slow Food International. When I first met Eddie, he told me that he started Project DISC because he was afraid that the food that his grandparents used to grow was rapidly disappearing as imported and foreign foods sort of took over the market in Uganda. He wanted to teach young people to appreciate, grow, eat, and market foods that are indigenous to the country. Unfortunately, these Ugandan fruits and vegetables are often looked down upon by farmers and eaters. They're considered poor people's food or even thought of as weeds. But for the last several years, Eddie has been working with dozens of nursery, elementary, and high school students, teaching them how to grow these forgotten foods, which incidentally are also very nutritious. And they also tend to be very resilient to high temperatures, flooding, drought, pests, and disease. And these crops will likely be important for crop breeders in the future who are looking to grow foods that can withstand the challenges of a changing climate. And Eddie is really helping young people in Uganda realize that the foods that are native to their country are not poor people's foods, but really valuable foods for the future, especially in the fight against climate change. And this kind of thing is not just happening in Uganda. Farmers and chefs in Ireland, as we've seen over this weekend, are incorporating more indigenous and seasonal foods into their fields and onto their menus, proving that environmentally sustainable diets can also be really delicious. The second part of the recipe for a more climate-friendly agriculture system is finding ways to minimize food loss and food waste. And I know the speaker after me is going to touch on this issue quite a bit as well, but I think that this issue is so important that it bears hearing more than once. For me, you don't have to be religious to recognize that it's a sin that today roughly 40% of the global harvest is wasted before it ever reaches people's stomachs. Here in Ireland, more than 1 million tons of food is wasted each year, and around 1/3 of this comes from households. That means that each of you is wasting about 80 kilograms of food per year. In sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the developing world, roughly 30% of all food is wasted because of poor infrastructure, like lack of roads, and also pests and disease and poor storage. And while preventing food waste presents obvious moral challenges, it also presents a lot of environmental challenges. Producing the food that we waste, not the food that we eat, the food that we waste, creates more greenhouse gas emissions than most countries do. The energy that goes into the production, harvesting, transporting, and packaging of that wasted food generates more than 3.3 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. If food waste were a country, it would be the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, just behind the United States and Canada. The good news is that preventing food loss and food waste and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it can be both simple and inexpensive. The advice for consumers tends to be very simple. Don't buy more than what you can eat, store your produce properly, take leftovers home, don't throw away food that hasn't gone bad, and trust your senses, not expiration dates, to tell you if food is safe to eat. In poor countries, food loss rather than waste is really the problem because farmers can't get their crops from field to storage to market in time. But there are a number of strategies that small-scale farmers are using to better store and process crops, including very simple things like cutting the green tops off sweet potatoes and other vegetables before they are stored, and investing in better processing techniques, including drying fruits and vegetables. In Mali, for example, I met with farmers who were working with an organization called the World Vegetable Center, and they were testing how to make powders out of things like tomatoes and okra to use in sauces later on after the season was over. These sorts of practices can have amazing side benefits because they're not only helping farmers lose less of their crop, but they're also providing an additional source of income that farmers would not otherwise have throughout the year. The final component of the recipe for mitigating climate change is really recognizing the important role that women play in the food system. And there's a reason that I've been showing you pictures of only women farmers during my talk. Women make up at least 43% of the global agricultural labor force. And in some countries, including many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, they make up as many as 80% of all farmers. Unfortunately, women farmers are often discriminated against and don't have the same opportunities as their male counterparts. According to research from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, if women had the same access to resources as men, including things like land, education, extension services, banking and financial services, and other resources, they could raise yields by up to 20% and lift as many as 200 million people out of hunger. And I've personally seen what women can do when they have more resources and more equality in their lives. For example, when I was in Niger a few years ago, I met with an amazing group of about 50 women who had started a communal garden. Niger is a country that continues to experience erratic rainfall and drought, and many farmers are really just struggling to figure out ways to cope. The women I met had started using solar drip irrigation practices, which really helped them target water supplies to crops while also eliminating the need for fossil fuels to run pumps. These women are also growing indigenous fruit tree varieties and other crops, which tend, again, to be very hardy and resilient to drought and disease. Before the women started the garden and really started working together as a community, they earned about $300 per year, which is obviously less than $1 per day. Today, by using a combination of high and low technologies, they're making about $1,500 per year, which is obviously about 5 times more. But it's more than money that these women have gained. They've really been able to innovate their way to a sustainable life. And they are just one example of how women around the world are figuring out how to grow and produce foods in ways that help make agriculture more environmentally friendly and resilient to climate change. In the lead up to the Paris climate negotiations last December, Food Tank worked with the organization CARE International to put together research on the role of farmers in fighting climate change. We found that to achieve true food and nutrition security in the face of climate change, women's rights must be addressed across the entire food chain, including food production, distribution, and consumption. And we also found that it's very important to remember that farmers are not just food producers. They're business women and men, innovators and entrepreneurs, inventors, and maybe most importantly, they're stewards of the land who deserve to be recognized for the role they provide, being stewards and providing ecosystem services, including resilience to climate change, that really benefit us all. I do not think that there is one silver bullet or one recipe for solving the climate crisis, But I do think that some of the ingredients I've talked about today, including focusing on indigenous crops, preventing food loss and food waste, and cultivating equality in the food system, all hold really enormous potential. And the practices that I've talked about can be replicated and scaled up, not just in poor countries, but in the industrialized world as well. What's clear to me from all the time that I spent on the ground is that the way things are isn't the way they have to be. We have a real opportunity to build the kind of food system where everyone has a seat at the table and no one is on the outside looking in, where traditional practices are not ridiculed, but invested in and scaled up, and where climate change is not something that we're scared of, but something that we're learning to figure out through sustainable agriculture practices. I will end there. I want to thank you again for your time, and I'll look forward to questions later. Thank you.
I might just have a question for you. Just hold it there for a second. Yeah. Okay, a big thank you to Danielle. That was fascinating, and I think the one thing that's just what she said at the end, that we shouldn't be scared of it, because sometimes it's really, we hear it that it's constantly being scaremongering and stuff. So I really think that is. Just a very quick question, Danielle, just to ask you, what's the small things that we can do ourselves, not at government level, but us ourselves?
I mean, I think part of the challenge is really recognizing that we all have a role to play. In the United States, we often hear the adage, vote with your fork, and every bite that you take has an impact on the environment. But we also need to vote with our vote and vote for the policymakers who will eventually make the changes that we need to see. On a very personal consumption level, the role we can play in preventing food waste in our own homes is tremendous. This has become such a hot issue over the last several years. We can all make changes in how we buy and consume food so that we're not wasting it, so that it doesn't end up in landfills. We can, have better eating practices, better composting practices that can really help solve that problem.
Brilliant. And then also as well, you write so many articles in the paper. Some of them are incredible. One that really stood out to me was to reduce hunger, put innovation on the menu. I really found that very interesting. And some of your talks, you've worked with Chef Dan Barber as well, who shares the same message. One of your other articles that really stood out as well, and when I read it, first of all, I said, it'll probably never work in Ireland, because it said, don't farm naked. We get about 2 days of sunshine here and everybody gets naked. But also, just before you go, could you just remind people about Food Tank and how we can just get involved, or what Food Tank is?
Sure.
Please.
Let me address the don't farm naked adage. That is something that Ireland is actually very good at. You use a lot of cover crops here, and that's you keep the soil covered for more than just when crops are being grown. It's a really good way to help sequester carbon in soils. Food Tank is a research organization, as I said, really dedicated to helping inspire all of you as eaters, farmers, businesses, policymakers to make change in the food system. We really try to highlight stories of hope and success on our website every day. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's foodtank.com. If you have questions or criticisms or ideas of folks we should feature, please email me at danielle@foodtank.com.
Great. Thanks very much, Danielle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So a big round of applause, please.